Hello, everybody. Today, our focus is World War II and specifically the war on the home front, what happened with people in the United States during the war, and the legacy or the effects of the war. So, first off, our main idea for this, there's two sections for this, one on the home front, the second, the legacy. The first section is specifically on the home front. The main idea of this section is that many Americans on the home front made huge contributions to the Allied war effort and the Allied victory in the war. And remember, the United States partnered in the war with Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. It matters now because World War II caused lasting changes in the lives of civilians and in the whole world that still impact our life to this day. So, first, wartime production. The War Production Board was something that was put in place to make things for the war effort. So the War Production Board had factories produce important war goods, things like planes, tanks, weapons, and medical supplies. And the factories that had been idle during the Great Depression and that had sprung up during the Roaring '20s to make things like cars and vacuum cleaners shifted their production to this war production. Factories themselves need a lot of workers to make these things. So during the Great Depression, we had huge unemployment. But now that there's so much demand for these supplies, factories need a lot of workers to make these things, so jobs are easy to find. Unemployment goes way down, the economy improves dramatically, and the Great Depression finally comes to an end due to the production during and leading up to World War II. The military needs a lot of supplies, things like gasoline, tires, shoes or rubber to make the shoes, meat and sugar. All those things are rationed back in the United States. Families were limited in how much they could have so that there was enough supply for the war. The war was also very, very expensive. So to pay for the war, actually to pay for the majority of the war, the United States issued war bonds, and then they also raised taxes and found a few other ways to come up with money. But the majority of the war from the United States side was paid for through government-issued war bonds. Because of the war, there's a number of opportunities for women and minorities that rise up that weren't there before the war itself. So many men fighting in the war, either because they volunteered or they were drafted or kind of forced to go into the war. Women began working in factories, shipyards, and offices, jobs that previously men would have been in. Women filled those roles during the wartime. Rosie the Riveter becomes a symbol of hardworking women doing whatever it takes to help win the war effort. So whenever you see this "We Can Do It" poster, this image, this woman is Rosie the Riveter, and she's this symbol of hardworking women. In addition to women, more than 1 million African Americans worked in the defense industry during the years. Since most of the factories are in the Northeast and the West, there is kind of a renewed great migration out of the South to those factory jobs in the North and in the West. In addition, more than 46,000 Native Americans work in wartime industries, and tens of thousands of Hispanics, including Mexicans, work in wartime industries, and especially with Mexico, they come as farm workers through something known as the Bracero program. We also know during this time that a lot of the women and minorities, even though they had jobs, they were not necessarily in many ways given equal treatment, equal pay, or anything. So there was still racism, prejudice, and discrimination in the United States. And one of the biggest examples of intense discrimination and racism in the United States is the internment of Japanese Americans during this time. Even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were subject to prejudice and discrimination, but this gets much worse after the United States enters World War II. President Roosevelt signs an executive order calling for the removal of the Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast, and then they are put onto internment camps in kind of the Midwest and more western parts of the country, but not West Coast, in what becomes known as Japanese internment. More than 100,000 Japanese Americans are interned. More than 2/3 of those people are Nisei, or Japanese Americans of Japanese descent. There were these fears of disloyalty from Japan. People were fearful that they were going to have to fight a Japanese enemy from within inside the United States. These fears turned out to be pretty much completely unfounded. The internees, the people in the camps, actually put up the American flag each morning. And in addition, thousands of young men that were in the camps, these Japanese Americans taken away from their homes, put in these internment camps, volunteer to fight, and they fight for the United States. These regiments of Japanese Americans fighting for the U.S., mostly the U.S. Army, fought mostly in Italy. Huge numbers of Japanese Americans, even though they were interned and taken away from their homes, still volunteered to fight for the United States in World War II. So that's some stuff with the Homefront. You'll do more on another assignment with the Homefront in addition to this. But now I want to move to the legacy of the war. It's kind of what comes because of the war's end. The main idea of this section is that World War II has a deep and lasting effect on the United States and the whole world, which will going to be our next unit. We'll shift into that. And it matters now because as a result of World War II, the United States becomes one of the two dominant superpowers in the world, along with the Soviet Union or the USSR. So the human cost. The war had an immense human cost. The most destructive in world history, World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. At first, it was known as the Great War because so many died and it was so big. World War II takes World War I, makes it look relatively small in comparison. 20 million soldiers die, millions more wounded, and tens of millions of civilians around the world are also killed or wounded by World War II. Both the Allied and the Axis powers engage in bombing in cities and factories, so they don't just fight on a battlefield, but everywhere became the battlefield. So because of that, there were lots of civilian casualties, so regular everyday people living in their homes were killed or wounded, and there were large numbers of refugees, people left homeless, familyless, jobless, with major disabilities because of their injuries. Major effects on the war. And we can see the casualties in the war, dead and wounded. So it's like Soviet Union and Germany. And then China have some of the biggest impacts, with Italy and France having some of the lowest impacts. So there's also economic winners and losers that come out of World War II. Many of the world's economies are in ruin, especially because of that total war. Their cities were destroyed, their farms are destroyed. So Europe and Asia, really in rough shape. Almost no fighting happened in the United States. So there's the bombing in Pearl Harbor, there's some stuff that happens in Alaska, there's some stuff off the coast in the ocean with German submarines. Might have been some Axis submarines and some German submarines that maybe get into the Great Lakes somehow, but almost no real action compared to other countries in the United States. So the U.S. actually comes out of the war with a pretty strong economy. The United States is then going to work to rebuild the economies of Europe and Japan after the war, and they did that through something called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is going to tie in heavily to fighting communism in the Cold War that we'll look at in the next unit. But for right now, we just want to focus on that. Under the Marshall Plan, the United States gives more than $13 billion to European countries, who in turn bought American products to help rebuild their countries. The United Kingdom and France get the most money. So West Germany, Italy get a lot. The United States helps rebuild these countries. Back at home, there's also changes in American society. When American soldiers return home from the war, there's immense competition for jobs and education. So many of those people that got jobs in factories during World War II lose those jobs when the war is over. But in response to some of the competition for jobs and education, the United States passes the GI Bill of Rights, and that basically gives those veterans educational and economic help. They can get money for school, money to build a house, money to basically repay some of their service for the war. Under this GI Bill of Rights, the U.S. government provided returning soldiers a living allowance for housing and a scholarship for higher education. Also during this time, like we talked about, The Second Great Migration continues both during the war and after, as African Americans continue to migrate out of the South in large numbers to work in factory jobs in the West. Well, so the production continues to boom, and there are still jobs, even though some people do lose jobs following World War II. The jobs were different. It's not sharecropping that existed in the South as much. They're better paying jobs, but discrimination and prejudice continue to exist throughout the country. That'll be something we'll look at in a couple weeks as we move in more with the civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s. So the lasting legacy of the war is the Nuremberg trials. Aside from dealing with matters at home, the United States also joins the world in dealing with war crimes. The international community and the United Nations helped set up a court to try Nazis for their role in World War II. These court proceedings are known as the Nuremberg trials. The charges against the Nazi defendants include crimes against humanity, referring to the Nazis' murder of millions of Jews, Gypsies, Russians, Poles after World War II, or during, World War II. After a year-long trial, 19 of the Nazi leaders are found guilty. Of those 19 Nazi leaders, 12 are sentenced to death. The trials uphold the idea that people are responsible for their actions even in wartime. More. Of World War II, so we had the League of Nations before World War II. After World War I, that was mostly a failure. But after World War II, there's a new attempt to try to create an international peacekeeping body, and that is the United Nations. The horrors of war convinced many people that nations must work together to try to keep the peace. So in April of 1945, delegates or representatives from 50 nations, including the United States, meet in San Francisco, California, to create a new international peacekeeping organization. All 50 of those nations approve a charter to create what is known as the United Nations, or the UN. Today, there are several hundred countries in the United Nations. It has many strengths in some areas, other areas not as strong as it could be. Finally, there's international tensions after the war. Despite the creation of the United Nations, there's still many tensions between different nations after the war. One example, and it's an ongoing issue that still exists to this day, is issues in the Middle East between Jewish people and Israel, and Palestinians and Arabs. The United Nations decides, in part in response to the atrocities committed towards Jews through the Holocaust, to create the nation of Israel. Both Jews and Arabs, Jews and Christians, all have a connection to the land of Israel, and especially Jerusalem. But following World War II, the United States creates the state of Israel. Some land is taken away from Palestine and Arab countries to create this. So Arabs and Palestinians oppose this, and fighting immediately breaks out. And there is continued fighting almost to this day between the state of Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. Meanwhile, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union grow increasingly strained. The Soviet Union wants to spread communism. The United States wants to halt that spread and spread democracy. This ideological battle between communism and democracy, along with the introduction of atomic weapons, is going to lead to the Cold War, which we'll talk about next week. That's it for now. Make sure you're answering all the questions. Make sure you're asking me questions as you have them. And please, please, please make sure that you are reading the feedback I give on the questions that you answer. Thanks, guys. See you later.